Thanks for everyone who reached out to me over the last couple days just on the concept of a rolling wheel without slipping. It's a really important concept that we as trainers and exercise professionals need to understand, because it's the difference between an effective exercise protocol and somebody, to be honest, having a major knee injury or shoulder injury for that matter. But one of the things, let's start with what rolling without slipping is. Well, it's just a principle of physics, right? Does an object, be it a wheel, roll down a path without slipping, right? Other sort of scenarios that can happen, right? So we have a rolling wheel without slipping that basically moves through space. Think of your car tire type thing. You have what's called spinning. So what'll happen is you have rotation without any forward translation. And then you have skidding, which is forward translation without any spinning. That's bad. That is basically the premise of an ACL rupture, right? So let's look at this for a second, right? So if I'm going to deal with basically a wheel, right? I did not go to art school, so let's say that's 360 degrees, right? So that wheel has a center of mass, which kind of goes right in the center, hence why they call it center of mass. Our bodies also have a center of mass. So when looking at it, if we're going to look at it and go, okay, well, if I'm going to be rolling across that ground surface, so we're going to be going in that direction. So let's put some forces to this, right? And they're described basically in vector format, so to give it some sort of magnitude. So let's have position A, B, C, and D, right? So they're all going to be going this way because we're dealing with translatory force going in that left direction. So if I'm looking at that going, okay, so those are the forces associated with translation. If we want to look at the forces of rotation, which is torque, right? So what we're going to do is figure out where that axis is, right? So that to the line of force, which is going to be the outer surface of that radius here. So because I'm on the top, I'm just going to make that here. So that's going to go that way. Because we're talking torque, there's going to be a rotational force that's going to be down over here because, you know, when you're rolling that way, this wheel is spinning and going that way. So we have a force equal going backwards. And now we have to worry about the upside of that backside of that wheel. So that's going kind of up. Now if we look at it and go, okay, well, let's look at this. So these forces, they kind of create that resultant force over here. Same thing here. That one goes that way, and that one's, as we've already drawn out, we got plus. But the interesting thing is, down at the bottom, those forces, that forward force and the reverse force, right, going that way, well, that equals 0. So the instantaneous velocity at that contact point is 0 velocity. Now it gets interesting. So we have a 0 velocity here at the bottom at that contact point, and we have a doubling of speed or velocity, the magnitude, up at the top. So if I'm looking at a human right now, and let's say I have a human in here and I'm kind of running, you know, so let's all of a sudden, we'll move that forward a little bit. We'll just shift that because obviously my drawing skills aren't the best. So at this point here, you're going to have a force going that way, a force going back. This force up here, be it my head, is functioning the same as the top of that circle. And how do we know that humans, when they're running, that, well, they're rotating? Well, if I put a block right here and I didn't see it, this guy here would fall flat on his face. So therefore, we can understand that that human is translating forward, created via a whole series of rotational effects, right? So all of those different muscles are rotating. So we have to be okay with that. Now, if we blow this up and we sort of say, well, let's just look at moving the ground, right? So we're not going to talk about the ground contact surface anymore. We're going to talk about that tibial plateau, right? So that tibial plateau all of a sudden needs to be the ground. Well, what's going to happen at the forces associated with all this? Well, above, well, you still have a center of mass. It might be moved a little bit because we're getting rid of that lower sort of leg. in the equation, right? So all of a sudden, you still have all these distances from these axes. You're still translating this way. So all of a sudden, we have to think about what's going on at that knee joint, right? So instantaneous, zero velocity at that knee. Cool. Most ACL injuries occur instantaneously. So we just have to be okay with that. And why women have a greater propensity to blow out their ACL? Well, there's a number of factors, right? Obviously, you can look at it and go, well, it's hormonal, depending on where they are within their menstrual cycle. Yeah, cool, that's one thing. You can look at Q angles, just another thing. But one thing that we currently, it's not much literature on is, well, let's look at where their base of support is. Let's look at where their center of mass is and look at the distance above that center of mass relative to what's below that center of mass, right? Because if we're talking about men and women, men historically have a higher center of mass. So the torque values are going to be different when you think about starting and stopping. And when we're looking at change of direction, which is where most non-contact ACL ruptures occur, injuries as well, so right, it doesn't necessarily have to be a rupture. Where they mostly occur is during change of direction. And when you change direction, you have to zero out your velocity going in one direction, right? Generating huge amounts of isometric force. It's not zero. It's not zero isometric force. It's, if you're running, it's potentially change of direction, get out of there. Well, if I'm looking at decel rapidly, I might be 9, 10, up to 12, 15 times body mass, right? So I have to generate huge amounts of isometric force rapidly, instantaneously, in order to change direction. So these are just some of the things that we have to consider, right? So how do you increase isometric force generation? Do you train it dynamically? Well, it's very inefficient. It's very ineffective. Now, if we're looking at knee structure, well, there's 9 knee flexors, right? Not just your hamstrings. There's 9 knee flexors that we have to put into that equation. If we're talking about knee extensors, well, there's your quadriceps, right? And there's also this other muscle. It has a small role, but a very important role in moving your bursal sac, which is called your articularis genu. So if that muscle doesn't work properly, neither does knee extension, really, because the bursa doesn't move it and it gets caught. So these are some things we think about. And it's like, okay, well, if there's 9 muscles down here, right, that are associated with knee flexion, then you have to compound that by going, what's at the hip structure? What's at the ankle structure? So it gets wickedly complex really fast, right? So if you have an unstable base of support, well, you're gonna have instability. Well, running on instability, we know it's bad. If I do all this mobility hip training and I destabilize that, how that head of your femur goes into that acetabulum, right? Let's say I loosen off that joint capsule, which is totally possible, and I increase the range of motion of my hip joint. So all of a sudden it becomes less stable up here. And then I'm thinking I all of a sudden have, you know, what down here, let's say that's 5 degrees, right? So 5 degrees change there might down here look like, you know, significant greater distance than up here. So we have to be okay with this. So if we're destabilizing joint structure at the proximal end of your femur, what's going to happen at the distal end of your femur, right? It's going to be magnified. So we got to be wickedly concise with what we're trying to do. And let's say I increase that range up at that junction, you know, where that head of the femur sort of meets that acetabulum, right? Inside. Let's say I loosen that off by 2 millimeters, 0.07-ish of an inch. What's the effect down here? Ask yourself those questions, apply that same concept, and explore, right? That's what we're asking for. We're asking for the exploration of, right? Because up here at this hip joint, you have these 6 sort of different looking muscles. You have this big, huge butt muscle, right, that goes that way. Then you got that leg thing down here. So if I'm destabilizing all that, there's going to be a negative outcome. Injury rates are going through the roof, both for your ACL, your Achilles, as well as your hip. Think about that. We're doing something wrong. I think this is the solution. If you like it, brad@isofit.com. Just fire me off an email. Let me know you appreciate these videos because the information's in my head. I don't have to do them. Cheers.